My name is Rebecca Irvine. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Assistant Director in the Center for Gender and Global Context at Michigan State University. Just wanted to thank you all for coming today and attending this panel that is entitled Sexuality and Reproductive Rights Are for Everyone, including women with disabilities in advocacy, activism, and research. I'm personally very excited about this panel, so I can't wait to get it started. I just wanted to also notify everyone that this session will be recorded. If you have any issues, please let us know as soon as possible. And also we would ask that everyone keep their video off and muted unless you are directed to do something different. Just while Becca's speaking, I think it would be best if we could kind of keep the background noise to a minimum. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Becca Kammes, who is a Hegarty postdoctoral fellow in the College of Education at Michigan State University, and also one of our very own gencen research fellows. So we're very happy to have her today, and she'll give you a bit more introduction to her background before she starts the talk.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here with everyone this morning. And thanks for coming. I don't know if everyone is in Michigan. I know I'm in Chicago, so it's like an hour earlier for me, and I'm not a super morning person. So I always thank people for coming to morning presentations because I don't always make it to them. So today, like Rebecca said, I'm going to talk to you guys about sexuality and reproductive rights, specifically in the context of women with a disability. So a quick little background on me. I come from a very clinical background. I am a couple and family therapist, or a marriage and family therapist is the more commonly used term. And I have a background working with people with adults, specifically with disabilities, and most specifically with intellectual and developmental disabilities and autism. So like I said, I have a very clinical background. I come from working with families. From a clinical standpoint, I am a sex educator and a sex therapist as well. So I have worked in a lot of like the realms and the areas of around sexuality, including like, policy and advocacy and all that kind of stuff. But again, I have sort of more of that clinical background. So I did want to start by just having everyone who, if you guys can, just in the chat box real quick, write down like what field or industry you were in, just so I can get an idea. Like I said, I'm clinical, so I want to know what else everyone, and also a researcher. I should point that out, as a postdoc and all that, I am also into research. So if everyone could just take a few minutes and write down in the chat box, what industry or field you kind of come from. And also, I don't have it on the slide, but if you could also write down if you have any experience working with people with disabilities, like maybe even just write like yes disability or no disability, so I can get a sense of like who we have and where everyone is coming from. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to do that. Let me see if I can pull up the chat. Here we go. Okay. So far it's looking like we have people who either have yes or some work with disabilities. Okay. See how many. All right, so I'm not sure if people are still adding, but like I'll kind of go back and look through that a little bit as well. So it looks like we kind of have a little bit of a mixed bag, which is exciting and fun. And so I'm glad that everyone will be able to come at it. It sounds like some of you have some like critical disability studies or have like some experience with disability, and then other people are saying no. And then we have like, it looks like psychology and some interior design. That's cool. Advocacy. Okay, so it'll be great. We'll have like, I'm hopefully when, because I'll have a lot of the examples and the things that I will bring up, we'll have more of that clinical kind of background. So it'll be really interesting to hear your guys' point of view and what you guys think about how that can kind of fit into your work, or if you had come across this person in your work, like what you might have been, what might have came across your brain, so we can get some different perspectives on it. So awesome. So I'm going to start with a introduction to, let me make sure that I have this all set up. start with an introduction to what is disability. So this might be kind of boring for some of you who have worked with disability before, but I thought it would be good for us to kind of go and just at least do a few activities. I should say, I guess I do have for this presentation, we're going to have me talking a lot because of course this is on Zoom. So that's just kind of unfortunately what's going to happen. But I do have a lot of like case studies for us to go through, and then some activities I'll have you guys do kind of on your own, you know, and then hopefully maybe even have someone report back out if we kind of want to pick someone, or maybe just like, you know, have everyone write in the chat box again. That might be the easiest. So we'll figure it out as we go. But so again, I'm going to start with just sort of a background on disability and what's kind of what disability really means, and some stats around disability as well. So the general accepted term or definition for disability is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movements, senses, or activities. Some of the more commonly accepted types of disabilities, like this is the CDC categories that they tend to put them into. We have autism, which I'm sure everyone has heard about or has read something about. It's a big ticket item these days, and we're learning a lot more about it every day. So it's always kind of a big thing in the news. It's also been a big thing on like Netflix with, you know, a lot of individuals with autism. Autism in Love was the name of a documentary. There was also a recent one, I believe it was just called Love on the Spectrum. So that's a big one that people have probably all heard about. And we've got intellectual disability. Those are people who have sort of cognitive disabilities that's usually measured by some sort of like adaptive, like how much like adaptive functioning they have, and how much in terms of like IQ tests as well, unfortunately, are still used a lot in that context. Then we have physical disabilities, hearing impairments, vision impairments, and communication disorders. So the majority of what I'm going to talk about today will fall under the autism, intellectual disability, and communication disorders context, because that's where I have the most experience. But again, if you have different kinds of experiences, if you have, you know, I think the easiest way will probably be if you have something that you want to say, or something, you know, that I'm talking about, and you want to like add in your experience, and it has like something to do with a different type of disability or a different area, like just type into the chat box, and then I can kind of, you know, maybe like respond to it or go from there. So let's start with doing an activity. We'll see how well this goes. I don't know if I'll be able to get too much of a reaction out of you guys, but at least you guys will be able to do it yourselves. So what's going to happen first of all is I'm going to put up 3 sentences. I'll give you about 5 seconds for each sentence, and then I'm going to make the sentences go away. And I want you guys to see if you can figure out what the sentences are saying. So kind of trying to get us in the mindset of what, you know, individuals with disabilities, especially those with intellectual disabilities or communication disorders, kind of what are some of the experiences that they have, you know, on a daily basis. So we're going to go ahead, like I said, 3 sentences, you'll get about 5 seconds each, and then they'll go away. Okay, so maybe like using like maybe some of those you know, where you can clap your hands or put up your hand or something on the on your screen. Can anyone maybe like show me if they felt like they understood what the sentences were, that they were able to read them? See if anyone. No. Oh, uh-oh, now where did I go? Okay, we got some people. Okay, yeah, so reactions are along the bottom of the shared Zoom screen in case anyone didn't know that. Thanks, Emily. So yeah, so it looks like, you know, we had some issues. Now I'm trying to figure out how to go back to where my stuff was. All right, here we go. So I'll go back and I'll show you, and I'll tell you what the sentences said so you guys can kind of get an idea. Okay, so the first one says, the black cat sat on the roof. The second one is, a yellow feather floated down. And the third one is, there were 2 men on the porch. So as you guys can see, if you look at them, you can see they're sort of written backwards, but still in the same, you know, sentence. You just got the is backwards, black is backwards. And a lot of people with disabilities, this is kind of, you know, some of the experiences that they may have, especially in terms of, you know, maybe not this exact experience, but the idea that they're given something, they're given, you know, something to read, they're given something to do, a task to do, and they're told, well, it typically takes people about this long to do it, so you should be able to do it. And they aren't really given the extra time or the extra, you know, whatever sort of needs that they have in order to finish that activity. And then because of that, they feel very like frustrated and, oh my gosh, and I can't figure this out. And that's sort of a cycle that they can get stuck in a lot. So that's, kind of one sort of example. Another one, you guys have probably seen this before, and I'll give you guys, a few minutes to kind of do it, but this has been over the internet before, and it's just kind of a fun one as well, but to talk about, again, that idea of having to make your brain take an extra step to figure something out and how tough that can be if you're not given the proper time to do it. This time I'll let it sit up there so you guys can kind of read them and have fun. But this is one where you're going to see a bunch of words, and I want you to say, like, out loud to yourself, the color that the word is written in and not what the word says. So you can take a few minutes to kind of look through those. Let me see if I have, All right, I hope I didn't screw something up here, but so Rebecca, tell me if suddenly my screen went a little weird. So again, just another like fun activity, but to kind of get, into the mindset and the idea that, a lot of, okay, let's see, did I screw something up? Okay, everything looks good, awesome. So I'm over here pressing buttons, and sometimes technology is not always my friend. So again, just an idea to kind of get us into, this mindset of what, people with disabilities might be experiencing. And also to point out, this one is commonly also used for individuals with autism, where it's like, they sort of interpret or see something one way, and then they have to purposefully take that extra step to make their brain see or do what it is that the person is asking or what other people are sort of asking or saying. So a few further examples of this for you, just to kind of, again, get us into that mindset. Think about if you, like what you would do if you, if for your house, the place that you live, the place that you worked, if you suddenly were in a wheelchair and you, were unable to kind of move about outside of your wheelchair, like what are some of the things that you would have to make accommodations for? Like what are some things right now in your house that you would have to fix? Like how many things would get in your way, would make it harder for you to be able to move around, and just how many like adaptations you would have to make. So think about how your workplace and your current home are not really set up or prepared for people with disabilities, and kind of how, and that's an experience that again, people in wheelchairs have, and people with mobility issues have a lot of times. As well as think about, anytime trying to attempt to grab, like if you were to try to set up your workspace for the day, you have your paper, you have your pen, you have your computer. Imagine trying to set up that workspace with only one hand, being able to only use one hand and kind of set everything up, and think of how much longer it would take you. You would still be able to get everything done. You'd be able to get it all set up, but it just might take you a few extra minutes. And if you're rushing, or if someone is trying to rush you, how that might actually cause some issues for you as well. And then the final thing, again, also related to autism, think about, like more specifically, but think about the last time you tried to work or concentrate and someone was like yelling in the background, or there was really loud music or really loud distracting noises. And think about how hard it was for you to concentrate, to kind of get yourself into that mode and be able to, actually get your work done, and how you had to take a couple of extra steps to sort of block that out. And individuals with autism especially experience that a lot. That's kind of the sensory processing issues that they currently have, that they commonly have, I mean. So those are, again, just some examples getting us into the idea, so we can start to think about how we might need to do some like adaptive measures when we talk about, some of the sexuality and reproductive rights and advocacy and stuff that we're going to talk about later. So first off, some general disability stats. 1 second. So we know that 26% of adults in the US have some type of disability. That is 1 in 4 adults, or 61 million people in the US have some type of disability. You can see here some breakdowns based on disability type. So more commonly, if you kind of look at, because included in this are kind of adults of all ages. And we know that adults who may have been more typically developing when they were younger, they do, we lose mobility issues. We sometimes lose cognitive, we have cognitive issues as we grow up, as we age, as well as like hearing and vision. But a lot of these things as well, like stuff like especially cognition, and especially even like hearing and vision, they tend to include more so people who are, who have those issues prior to the age of 18. So, stuff like the mobility issues and things like that, you do have to take those, stats into consideration. But as you can see, this is kind of the breakdown Mobility issues obviously are the sort of highest percentage of adults in terms of disability type, but then cognition is another kind of higher one. And that's, like I said before, that's kind of where my work is and where my area of expertise is. So when we break that down and talk specifically about women, we know that 1 in 4 women in the US have a disability, have some type of disability, as mentioned before. And we know that women, when it comes to sexuality and reproductive rights, and we know when it comes to reproductive healthcare needs, when it comes to sexuality experiences and being able to have like sexuality expression, we know that women have different issues, or they have also different like needs compared to kind of the general population. And then when you take that disability component into consideration, you have you kind of have that added layer of need, like special needs or special concerns. But one of the Autism Women's Network, I thought actually kind of says it sort of the best, is that my needs aren't special. How my needs are met may be different, but they are the same needs as anyone else's. So just kind of thinking about that fact that, they still have all of the women with disabilities tend to have all of the same needs, the same healthcare needs, the same, advocacy needs, the desire to have the same experiences, but how those needs are met are probably going to be a little bit different. They're going to need extra time. They're going to need, extra space. They're going to need extra information. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's something that we don't always think about and people don't always take into consideration. So we're going to go and talk about a few stats that are related to disability and the sort of sexuality, reproductive rights, and experiences. So first, we know that 1 in 3 women with a disability do not have a usual healthcare provider, which is an issue, because if you don't have someone who you are seeing, frequently, who you are seeing at least, once a year, it's really hard for that person to get to know you, for you to be able to, if you have medications that you need to continually take every year and you need to talk about how those medications are impacting you, that can be a big issue. And then especially for women in general, but then especially when you have that added layer of having a disability, if you have a mobility issue, if you have, a cognitive concern, anything like that, you have an added layer of something that needs to be taken into consideration when even just having the meeting that you have with your provider, or even just, thinking about what types of stuff, what types of, medications, what types of things you might need to be doing. And if you have to re-explain that to someone every single time you go in because you're having a new healthcare provider, that can cause a lot of issues and concerns. So we also know that 1 in 3 women with a disability have unmet healthcare needs because of cost. I think we all probably know or have heard that, healthcare and healthcare costs are a concern across the board for a lot of people. And again, it's just sort of that added layer of, when you start to look at kind of like layers of oppression or layers of like, issues and concerns, adding disability into that is yet another, it adds to that. So if you're having, issues with lack of finances, especially with individuals with disabilities, they have really low employment rates. And when they are employed, they are more commonly employed in like minimum wage jobs. And especially in this pandemic, you have a lot of people who are considered as they have those essential worker jobs. And so they are putting themselves at more health risk by going to those jobs. But then if they don't go to those jobs, they have a lot of issues then with, because of health concerns, now suddenly they don't have an income. So that's a concern that's going to probably just amplify because of this pandemic. But even before this pandemic, we know that there was a lot of issues with healthcare costs and women with disabilities not being able to meet their healthcare needs because of that. We also know that 1 in 4 women with a disability did not have a routine checkup in the past year. All of these stats are according to the CDC. They have a Center on Disabilities. I forget exactly what it's called. I wrote it in a slide somewhere. So 1 in 4 women with a disability did not have a routine checkup in the past year, which is also kind of similar to what we were saying before. Especially women have to, almost every single year, we should be going into the doctor. We should be, I think they say now, like every 3 years, we should be getting a pap smear, all those kinds of things. And if you don't have that routine checkup with your doctor every year, you don't know kind of, where you're at. Like those are really important things to have and to do. And so we're knowing that at least 3 out of 4 women with a disability, or 1 in 4 women with a disability, are not getting that service. So let's talk about not just kind of the healthcare and reproductive healthcare side of it, but let's kind of go over to the intimate partner violence and sexual harassment and exploitation, which is also more so where my work also takes place. As a therapist, I deal with a lot of, trauma and a lot of, individuals kind of like with families and sex education. So this is more so where a lot of, again, my work takes place. But if you, have any sorts of ideas or things, or if you want to talk about how this, other things work in other realms, please feel free to let me know. I would love to have those kinds of conversations, and we'll probably maybe be able to have a discussion at the end, hopefully. So we know that children with disability are 2 times more likely than typically developing children to experience some sort of violence in the home. We know that a lot of times this is by being witnesses and being kind of ending up being parts of intimate partner violence between parents. But we also know that this is violence directed directly at the child. And we also know that, research and stats tell us that individuals who are victimized as children are, more likely to become victims in adulthood as well. And so, you have children who have a disability and already have a harder time, maybe, getting around, or have a harder time learning, certain, like trying to kind of, learn some of those social cues and understand some of that. And then they're put in this situation where they are abused or taken advantage of, and they kind of learn that might be, they have this sort of learned helplessness that maybe that's not really what I like, but that just seems to be how adults interact, so that when they get older, they then have those situations of like, well, that's just how this goes, so I don't report it, or I don't, think that this is weird or strange. So that can cause a lot of issues further down the road. We know that individuals with disabilities across the board, across disabilities and across, like for both males and females, are 4 to 10 times more likely to experience sexual abuse and exploitation and intimate partner violence. It's kind of a wide range, but that's because sort of on the one end of like the 4 times as much, you tend to have more males, because we know that males don't experience violence and sexual abuse, males with disabilities, as often as females. And you also have people with mobility issues and more like vision and hearing impairments, as well as like individuals with mental health disabilities or behavioral disabilities tend to be a little bit on that lower end of that. And then the 10 times more likely tends to be the individuals with cognitive disabilities, with autism, and also again tends to be more females as well. So when we specifically look just at females with an intellectual disability, which again, my kind of area of expertise, recent data has shown from the recent Department of Justice data has shown that women with an intellectual disability are 12 times more likely than the general population to experience some form of sexual abuse or exploitation in their adult life, which is kind of a really large and jarring number. So those are some of the stats related to sexual abuse and exploitation specifically, and also healthcare needs for individuals with disabilities. So when we think about those stats, there's a few things to just kind of consider and think about why some of those stats might be where they're at, or why, what might be some of the underlying things. So as a couple and family therapist, I am a systemic thinker. I cannot think of a person just like in one setting, which I'm sure most of us can't, but there are so many layers of things and so many rings around a certain person that, when you just talk about like how they individually, like you talk about individual psychology, and then you talk about community, and then you talk about family dynamics, and then you talk about, access to or lack of access to healthcare, and whether they're in a rural versus urban community. Like there's so many things to kind of consider, but some of the stuff that people have found recently that have been some interesting studies and things to consider, there is a distinct lack of training on disability for physicians. A lot of stuff there's been a lot of studies that have really shown like kind of like a needs assessment, where it's like they talk to physicians about how they feel working with disability. And not really a whole lot has been done on exactly how to fix that. Now there are some places like in New York, there's a USET out there that's doing some really great work on actually working to train physicians better around disability. But we do know from a lot of research that physicians across the board feel like sort of ill prepared to deal with disability specifically, unless that is their like area of expertise. A lot of them talk about how they don't really know how to adapt what they do when a person with a disability comes into them. So if you're just like a general, practitioner, or if you're, like a radiologist or someone who kind of doesn't really have, or, other, person who doesn't really have like a really specific, like you might just get people kind of in and out, who come in for a certain procedure and then leave. You don't always know exactly how to adapt what they do to work with individuals with disabilities, whether or not, that could be as simple as having better access for people with mobility issues. That could be, as simple as they don't have the proper handouts to give to individuals with intellectual disabilities. They don't have adaptive, worksheets or anything that has, helps them figure out exactly how to fill out the forms that they need to fill out, things like that. We also know that a lot of physicians do actually still have a misconception about asexuality among individuals with disabilities. So kind of this idea that they are not sexual beings. They don't have the same sexual desires, or if they have mobility issues, if they're in a wheelchair, that they have like a physical lack of sexual interest, or, anything like that, when that's definitely not the case. Like pretty much across the board, that, that is true of many individuals, but, not necessarily for everyone. And so a lot of physicians feel as if, they come in and they have this sort of misconception. So because of that, they avoid conversations around like birth control, or especially with women, like issues of reproductive health. They don't even think to ask them if they, want to have, if they need like, any, gynecological exams or STD testing or anything like that, because they just kind of assume that they're not doing that, that's not, that's not something that they're interested in. This misconception does kind of also happens a lot among family members and caregivers, not so much in a, and I should say actually going back to kind of that thing with physicians, we do know that women with disabilities are 3 times less likely to get routine mammograms and pap smears than the general population. So, and a lot of that is because a lot of times they don't necessarily know that they're supposed to do that. They're waiting, like they're kind of waiting for the physician to tell them that, and the physician doesn't, tell them to do that, because again, they don't really understand their needs or how to adapt those services for them. And then again, going back to, so there's that misconception among family members and caregivers. Again, that sort of myth of asexuality, which is going away more and more, but still definitely exists and persists in our society here, especially in the US. And you get a lot of family members and caregivers so there's a lot of forced sterilization that is still happening. That was definitely something that was happening a lot more previously, but a lot of family members and caregivers who have that idea of, oh, well, they're sexual beings and they are going to want to have relationships and have experiences, but we really don't want them to have kids because they can't take care of a child themselves. So we're going to go ahead and we're just going to, have them either, get a vasectomy or have a hysterectomy. And a lot of, so there's still a lot of family members and caregivers who will go ahead and do that for their family member. And that's not always a decision that the individual with the disability feels like they can make themselves. So that also is something that kind of goes into, especially if you then have a family member or caregiver who's more in charge of you, like as a person with a disability, whether or not you go to the doctor is again, kind of more up to them, and whether or not they kind of push it depending on what sort of level of guardianship you have. So just some issues to consider when you think about some of those stats. So I just want everyone to take a moment and think about like a time when, again, kind of getting into that mindset and thinking about how people with disabilities, women with disabilities might have a different experience. Think about a time when you had to convince someone to let you date or see a person. For a lot of us, that might end up, we might have to go back to like high school when our parents maybe restricted us from seeing someone or said, you can't date that person, you can't go out on a date, you can't go out with people. It might even be kind of more recently when you said to a friend, oh, I'm going to date this person, or I like this person. And they're like, oh, I don't like them, that person, there's something about them. And you had to like convince that person. But people with disabilities experience this like very, very often. They have to, a lot of times if they don't have guardianship of themselves, or if they have mobility issues and they need someone to help, take them on a date or something, they have to, really kind of convince someone to let them do this. So just thinking about, again, that sort of, some of the power and privilege that gets taken away from individuals with disabilities around some of these topics. So Also, think about a time when you had to advocate for a doctor to take your concerns seriously. There's also a lot of ample evidence to show that women with disabilities, or women even without disabilities, women across the board have issues with this, with doctors a lot. That a lot of times, there's that stereotype of the woman being the drama queen. And so no one really, they think that what she's experiencing isn't actually as painful or as tough as what she actually is experiencing. So that's still a concern, and that is definitely even more of a concern for women with disabilities. Think about a time when you were not afforded privacy at a doctor visit because they feared you wouldn't really understand what they were saying. Again, for most of us, we're probably gonna have to go back to childhood for this. A time when your parent had to come in the room with you because the doctor didn't think that you would understand. For a lot of us, hopefully sometime in high school that it started to be a time when you maybe went in by yourself and your parents waited in the waiting room or something. But for, again, a lot of people with disabilities, especially intellectual disabilities, this is a really common occurrence. And the final thing I want you to kind of think about is think about a time when someone tried to tell you whether or not you should have children. So tried to have sort of some control over your reproductive rights. And well, a lot of us have probably experienced, parents either saying, when are you going to have kids, and when, and you should do that, or even maybe, saying, hey, you are terrible at keeping your own home clean and terrible at cooking, you shouldn't have any children, but those are opinions and things that technically no one can actually take control over that for you. To an extent, kind of generally speaking, here in America, no one can force you to get sterilized. However, if you don't have guardianship of yourself and someone kind of thinks that that's the best way to go, that can often happen for individuals with disabilities. So next I'm going to get to some examples. We're going to talk about, again, I have a lot of very clinical based examples, a lot of individuals I want to tell you about. I was hoping that maybe we would be able to have either some videos or audio from some of these people, but unfortunately that did not happen. And so you're going to just, again, hear me talk a lot. And I'm going to tell you about all these examples and these people and give you some background. But before I get to all of that, I did want to see if anyone had any questions or anything that they want to bring up. After the case studies, we can also talk about more maybe personal case studies or anything that you guys have. But for now, is there anything related to, the stats or, some of the background that I gave, some of the issues, and thinking about some of those issues for yourself and how that might look? Is there anything that anyone, I think if you want to just either type something in the chat box and I can respond to it, or if you want to talk, I'm not sure how we want to go about doing that, but if you maybe want to type in the chat box and then we can go from there. It doesn't look like anyone. Nope, nothing. Okay. All right, well, so then I'll just keep going and kind of talk about some of these examples. And okay, so since we do have, I should tell you, Rebecca, I cannot see all the numbers on here, so I have no idea who is here. Again, technology, not my super friend. So, but apparently there are few enough of us that if you do have something you want to say, please feel free to unmute and go ahead and talk if anyone has anything that you want to say. Also, I know while I'm saying some of these case studies, if you do have a question or something you want to talk about, I definitely would love to, instead of having to be at the very end, be oh, can we go back to that person? Feel free to just write something in the chat box and say, hey, I have a question about that person or something, and I can kind of take a break in between people and you can ask me, or you can kind of bring something up during the case studies as well. All right, so no one has anything specific, then we'll get on to some case examples. So again, these are things that are kind of related to some of the stuff that I've experienced, I've talked about, I've had, people that I know. All of these people are people that I know personally, well, except for the first one. First, we're going to talk about the Me Too movement. But So, you know, I would really encourage you guys to think about, again, like if you were to come across this person, or if you were to come across a situation, like what would you do in your work, or how would your work potentially affect this person? Because those are going to be some of the questions we're going to kind of reflect on towards the end. So first of all, I just want to make a comment about and kind of talk a little bit about the Me Too movement and kind of how disabilities sort of fit into this, because the Me Too movement provided sort of a really unique view into what, you know, some of the issues that it sort of was like this, you know, as you all know, I'm sure, this like social movement that kind of provided us a unique look and like into some of these scenarios and some of these experiences that people were having, and provided researchers too with a really interesting opportunity to look at some of these and how getting together as a community and kind of being able to share those stories and talk about them, and how that was bringing people together and how it was bringing attention to the topic and to the subject, and, you know, sort of some of the good and bad, you know, consequences of that. And one of the things that kind of was clear across the board is that the Me Too movement generally, a lot of research has shown that women in general have felt more empowered due to this movement, whether they are someone who has had one of these experiences and was like considered themselves a part of the movement, or someone who is just a woman who still considered themselves a part of the movement as like an advocate and an ally, or even just, you know, being on the sidelines and hearing some of these stories and recognizing like, oh, you know, like that, these are some strong women who are standing up and saying things that generally speaking, there was a sense of empowerment, right? This idea that there should be no guilt, no shame, and no stereotyping when it comes to these, you know, experiences of like sexual assault and intimate partner violence and abuse. And it also helped a lot of women feel very like awakened and united. Those were some of the kind of key things that have come, that like research has shown has kind of come out of this movement. But women with disabilities have indicated that they have felt distinctly excluded from this conversation and from this movement. There have been some inclusion of disability within that, and there was even like, I forget exactly what the hashtag was, but there was another hashtag that individuals, I think it might have just been hashtag Me Too, hashtag disability, but generally speaking, there was a lot of sort of not so much research on this, but things like coming out of like a lot of op-ed pieces from women with disabilities, places like The Guardian, Teen Vogue, Them Magazine, places like that ran a couple of articles where they talked about how women with disabilities felt very excluded from this conversation, that there were some issues with representation and feeling like women with disabilities weren't really represented, and also their experiences weren't really very represented within the Me Too movement. And there was also a lot of concerns with how they felt like they fit into this conversation. So generally what happened was women with disabilities, they felt as if, this is going to get a little confusing here, but women with disabilities felt as if women without disabilities thought that the women with disabilities had a very different experience. They felt like people who attack people with disabilities, you know, whether it's, you know, from sexual assault and intimate partner violence, coercion, all that stuff, that those people are viewed as more of a monster than when the person attacks someone without a disability. So the woman with the disability is sort of seen as, you know, that, you know, oh, that the person who did that to you is terrible. Whereas the woman without a disability is asked, you know, what were you wearing? What was the situation? How much did you lead them on? When that is absolutely not true. And a lot of women with disabilities are like, you know, that is not the experience that I had. The abuse, sometimes people view it as more overt, you know, that there's more of like, you know, really like aggressive or, you know, like kind of like rape scenarios, or there's like more aggressive or overt types of coercion going on for women with disabilities, but that, you know, sometimes it can be more nuanced for women without disabilities. Again, that is not true. And women with disabilities experience these issues in almost the same exact way, but they felt as if they were sort of excluded from that conversation because they felt as if the general population assumed they had a different experience. That's kind of the gist of what a lot of these like op-ed pieces were talking about, and just with concerns with how they exactly fit into it, and talking about how it is, you know, there are pieces of it that fit for us and we do fit into this, but we also still feel like there's a piece of it missing. Again, that kind of issue that people have with disability as well, where it's, you know, everyone kind of, things are going to have to be different. Their experiences probably are going to be different because of that extra layer of disability. And then also, the needs that they have in regards to kind of dealing with that afterwards, and the healthcare needs, and then the trauma, that they might have to, go through and talk about will probably look a little different and will be a little different, but, having to make adaptations for that isn't necessarily like a bad thing, and doesn't mean that they should be excluded from that. And there were a lot of women with disabilities who did still feel a part of the movement. So that's not necessarily clear across the board, but it was sort of an interesting piece of this. Just kind of to bring up and to mention and talk about, because a lot of these issues too, especially for women with disabilities, as we know across the board with sexuality and reproductive rights for women in general, there are policies, and there are, programming and all those things that do get in the way. But a lot of it also too is just like social understanding and how we think about these issues. And, women with disabilities experience that, and there's that added layer of disability to put in there as well. So again, I'm going to go through a few different people and just kind of give you some like quick case studies and talking about, I'm going to give you some background on the individual, and then what, their sort of issue was, and then talk a little bit about like my work with them, or what we did, kind of together, or what their experiences were, the stories that they told me, because I didn't necessarily work with all of these people, but I have, talked with all of them. And then again, just kind of go through, and I'll sort of, probably pause after each one and like take a drink or whatever. So feel free to, like, if you have something you want to say about that person in particular, or you have another question about them, or again, something related to your work or the way that you kind of think about it, feel free to like write that in the chat box, and I can kind of like bring that up, or even unmute yourself and you can just talk and ask your question. So first I'm going to start with Amy. Amy is, I also should probably, I don't know if I said this, I probably should have said this way in the beginning, but the terms ASD and ID are things that I will use commonly. I probably already have used them, but ID is just, an acronym for intellectual disability, and ASD is autism spectrum disorder. So when I say those, when those are written up on the screen, those are what I mean by that. So Amy was an adult woman with autism spectrum disorder. She is currently in her 40s. So we still currently right now have issues with diagnosing ASD in females. We're getting a lot better at it, and there is a lot that we're learning about it like every single day, but there still are some issues with how we diagnose ASD in males. And then when it comes to females, there's sort of this added extra layer, because they don't necessarily have, like, their social concerns don't really present themselves in exactly the same way that it does for males. So there's still some debate, and a lot of people have issues with that. But when you're talking, so if Amy's, 40 now, when you're talking 40 years ago, there definitely was not really a whole lot of conversation or understanding around how ASD looks in women. So Amy actually went almost, she did not get an ASD diagnosis until she was well into her 20s. But she kind of, dealt with a lot of these sensory issues, with a lot of these sort of social concerns and social issues throughout her whole life. And she especially has a lot of sensory concerns. So her story that is, specifically related to kind of this reproductive healthcare and reproductive, advocacy, reproductive healthcare advocacy. She has 3 children, and every single time she gave birth, she got pregnant and gave birth, she said it was the most miserable experience of her life because of all of these sensory issues that were sort of coming up for her. How being pregnant and that feeling of being pregnant and how it changed her body was just something that she had a hard time with sensory issues before. She was one of those people who really liked having like those weighted blankets, and she loved being like hugged and squeezed, especially as a kid. And so to kind of have that feeling of something growing inside of her and her body kind of expanding to do that, was something that she just didn't really handle very well. She would talk about this to the doctors and everything, and she'd talk about it with, to her mom and to other people, and people just kind of didn't really believe her or think that she, they thought that she was sort of making it up, or that she was just being, that being pregnant and having baby is the most beautiful thing in the world. And, there's something wrong with you if you aren't feeling that way, and you should just try to feel that way. She had a really terrible birth with her first child, had a lot of issues with not being able to concentrate. And she was, very distracted and couldn't push properly and couldn't get herself to push. And there was all sorts of, kind of issues around that. And because of that, for her second and third kid, they ended up just kind of doing a C-section, like straight up. They're like, this is what we're going to do because we know you had such a hard time the first time. And she dealt with a lot of, shame issues, especially from her parents, from her mother and from her sister, who didn't have some of these same issues, with the idea that you shouldn't have had all those problems. That shouldn't have been an issue for you. And then afterwards, when she was done having kids, she dealt with a lot of like menstrual pain with like really terrible periods. And again, having issues with doctors and people not taking her seriously, telling her she was being too sensitive, that, she shouldn't be worried about those kinds of things. Is it really that bad? And so she just had a lot of issues with that and had to really work on how to like advocate for herself. And she went to a self-advocacy group because, again, later in life, she was eventually diagnosed with ASD. And so she was able to find a community and a group of people to work with. And doing that self-advocacy group, she was really able to talk with some people and get some ideas on how she can go to her doctor and how she can, hold on, sorry, my dog. The joys of working from home. So, so that was kind of Amy's story, and having to sort of become an advocate for that, and some of her, issues with reproductive health and how that looked for her with the doctors and with those around her, and just how terrible of an experience that was. And she has her kids and she loves her kids and she's very, excited about that. But how they came into this world is something that she always says that she would rather forget that part. So again, I'll take a tiny little break if anyone wants to just, pipe up, say anything, write something in the chat box. No, nothing. All right. So we will go on and we'll talk about Brenda. So Brenda is an interesting woman. She has, so Brenda is someone with an intellectual disability, and then PD is just my little shorthand for physical disability as well. So Brenda is someone who, she has a lot of adaptive functioning skills, but she is a little lower in terms of cognitive skills. So she lives on her own in an assisted living kind of community where she has her own apartment. She has a lot of, a lot of ability to kind of she takes the bus every day to her job, and she's able to do all of those things. The assisted living community is a place where a lot of individuals with like disabilities or with, drug addiction, like who are in recovery, things like that, are like live. And so there is a person who is there, 24/7 kind of on the campus of the living community to help out if things like do happen. But for the most part, she lives pretty much entirely by herself in her own apartment and, goes about her day every day. But she does not have financial guardianship of herself. Her mom, and then now her sister, when her mom has gotten older, has financial guardianship, which basically means anytime she wants to take money out or she wants to do something, she has to ask them for that. They kind of, they help her pay her bills and things like that, because that's where that cognitive disability comes into it, where she has those adaptive skills, but she doesn't necessarily have some of the cognitive skills, or at least, they have gone to court and have told them that she doesn't have those cognitive skills, and now they have financial guardianship of her. But she is really interesting because her story has a lot to do with kind of these experiences of dating restrictions and how like sexuality experiences and those sexuality rights to have that right to have those sexuality experiences can be restricted for people with disabilities. So she would go to the doctor by herself and be able to have all those, conversations with the doctor, but she was unable to get birth control because that the doctor did say that they had to, get her parent, they had to get her guardian to sign off on it, which wasn't really technically true, but she also wasn't 100% aware of exactly what some of those issues were. So she didn't know, kind of to be able to say, no, I can just do this by myself. But so she had some issues getting birth control initially with her doctor, but part of why she wanted that was because she had started dating someone, but no one in her family and no one around her kind of took that relationship really seriously. They kind of thought that this was, just sort of a joking, fun relationship. I think she had even met him at work. So everyone thought this was one of those like, quote unquote work boyfriends, or, something where she said, that's my boyfriend, but she didn't really mean it. But she was going out on dates, and then that's why she also asked for the birth control. And when her family found out about this, they actually used their financial guardianship that they had over her to sort of stop her and restrict her from having those experiences. So they started holding back money from her if she was going to use it for dates. They said, we're gonna just give you exactly what you need for groceries, for rent, for this and for that, and you're not getting anything extra. And if you do need anything extra, you have to tell us exactly what it's for. So like, if you're going to buy presents for Christmas, you need to tell us exactly what you're buying, because they didn't want her going out on these dates. Also, the person in the assisted living community who was sort of in charge, they had restricted her from having someone overnight or from having the boyfriend in her apartment, which technically wasn't necessarily a restriction that other people in the community would have, and also was not something that was like written in the rules. So she was kind of really unsure how to deal with, like, why are you not allowing me to have my boyfriend over when my next door neighbor can have her boyfriend over, and things like that. So she really had to kind of advocate for herself, and she was able to, again, kind of eventually talk to a community. And I think her neighbor also really helped her as well, advocate for herself to be able to talk to people and say, hey, I actually should be able to have these experiences, and I do have the desire to have these experiences. And this really is a relationship that, we want to go on dates, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I should be allowed to get birth control, and eventually was able to go out on dates and everything, and still had some issues with obtaining birth control. But she was eventually able to do that, again, through sort of, advocating for herself, and really because she was able to connect with a neighbor who was able to help her as well. So that's the story of Brenda. Again, I'll take a little break, see if anyone has any, things they want to say about Brenda, or any questions they want to ask, or any issues. Nope. All right. Oh, okay, we got one. We got two, yay. Okay, could you say a bit more about what those self-advocacy skills look like for someone like Brenda? Yeah, so definitely, for sure. And then I'll get to, afterwards, Allison's about the access to contraception. So a little bit more about what self-advocacy skills look like for someone like Brenda. So a lot of times individuals with disabilities, especially individuals with intellectual disabilities, you have a lot of issues where having just grown up in the situations in which they grew up, and they were sort of told that they are, incapable of doing these things, that people, have to help them, that they, they have this sort of learned helplessness. So a lot of times there's a huge piece of education that needs to come in the very beginning of saying, like, these are your rights. These are the things that you do have access to. There's a lot of teaching, like for Brenda, teaching about what financial guardianship actually looks like, and the fact that financial guardianship doesn't necessarily relate to, so like she, the mom shouldn't still have had a say over what was going on in the doctor's office, because that isn't technically, that wasn't part of her guardianship. And that's another big thing. There are a lot of very different like levels of guardianship, which causes a lot of concerns. And so there's a lot of education in there, and kind of teaching them what these things actually look like and what their rights actually are. And then another big thing with self-advocacy skills is social skills. So kind of reteaching and talking about, so obviously Brenda did not go through like a self-advocacy program, but that's what like would have happened if she would have done something like that, and teaching some of those social skills on how to actually advocate. What are the things, like giving them the words, giving them the, what they need to know about, those social interactions. And then sort of having, a lot of times it's having someone help them kind of take that next step into actually saying something. So for Brenda specifically, what it was talking with her neighbor, and it was learning, the things about how the neighbor's still allowed to have the boyfriend over, how that isn't a restriction for everybody, how that technically is like discriminatory practices if they're doing it just for her, and how, she has the right and she should go say something to them. And so then also, being able to kind of, with the help of that neighbor and that friend, sort of get up the courage to be able to go, and then it's addressing those problems. It's actually going to the parent or guardian and saying, this is what I know now, and this is kind of where, what I want to do, and this is how I feel about the situation. Like I said, if they were to go through a self-advocacy program, there would be a lot more specifics around that and how to kind of, go through some of those steps. But for someone like Brenda, it's a lot of learning what her actual rights are, and then giving her the courage to actually stand up to someone and to say, this is actually what I need, and this is what I want, and this is what I know I should have access to. So I hope that answers your question. Let me know if you have any other specific things. All right, and then, so can you speak a little more to the issues surrounding access to contraception? Yeah, that's a huge issue especially for people with intellectual disabilities. And I will talk a little bit more, even the next person I'm going to talk about is a little bit more about like forced sterilization, which is another whole issue kind of on itself. But so especially people with disabilities, you have a lot of, like I was saying before, concerns about, where people see them as sort of asexual. They assume that they aren't going to want to have those, they don't have those sexual desires, that they aren't going to want to have those experiences. And then also, even if they do say it, people don't take it seriously. They see, boyfriends and girlfriends as like, oh, like if your preschooler were to come home and say, I have a new boyfriend at school, it's like people don't take those relationships seriously. They're like, oh, that's so cute. You have a boyfriend, you have a girlfriend. You get a lot of that kind of experiences where people don't view them as real relationships. And so when you have kind of that mentality surrounding it, and then you have an individual who tries to go to the doctor and says, I want some contraception, there's like, well, do you really need it? Are you really having the kind of relationship you think you're having? On top of that, will you know what, that even means, and how to, will you know if you're taking the pill, will you know to take the pill every single day? Are we going to be able to count on you to do that? Even if it is like, getting an IUD, like, are you going to understand kind of the, the care that goes into like around that, and how to take note of if you're having issues regarding the IUD? Like, are we, like there's just some concerns about whether or not they're even going to be able to really deal with all of those other issues that go around having contraception. So then people are less likely to prescribe it to them. And you have it, and the added issue of if they don't have, now Brenda was different because she should not have, like if she had said to the doctor that that's something she wanted, the doctor should have had that conversation with her and shouldn't have included her parent. But with other people with intellectual disabilities, if the parent has even further levels of guardianship, especially if they have like full guardianship, or they have like, power of attorney, all these kinds of, like, there's differing levels and all that, they can have different kinds of say in that. And so then whether or not the parent thinks it's a good idea suddenly becomes the issue. And I know, like, for me personally, when I was in high school and the doctor recommended me going on contraception for like purely like biological, physical reasons, and my mother had a bit of a freak out. And it's because, she had these values and these ideas around, if I let you have birth control, what does that mean? I'm saying it's okay for you to go have sex. Oh my goodness. Like, that was, kind of a crazy thing. And a lot of parents, still feel that way about their adult with a disability, even though they are an adult, they still kind of see them as someone that they have to take care of, that they have to worry about. And so those parental values sometimes get in there as well. And, if the parent blocks access to contraception as well, that is a big issue. Now, there is also the fact that doesn't necessarily stop people from going to the store and buying condoms. But when you also have lack of knowledge and awareness around some of those, and when you are saying something like that to a doctor and the doctor doesn't say, well, I'm not going to give this to you because your parent won't let me or whatever, but you could also just go get condoms. Like, if that information isn't given to the person as well, so that's where like that lack of education can be an issue as well to access. And that is a huge issue for individuals with disabilities, especially those with intellectual or developmental disabilities. We know that they are very commonly not given any sort of sex ed. They're usually, if they're in special education, they're able to sign out of any sex ed, like their parent can sign them out of having any sex ed that might even occur in the high school setting or like middle school setting. And so if they're not getting it there, and then they suddenly go into adulthood and they're having these experiences or having these desires, but they have even less education than around this topic than, the majority of the population, that also causes a lot of issues and barriers as well. So hopefully, again, that, answered your question, but if you have more, let me know. All right. And awesome. So I'll move on to the next person unless there's anything else. And we can always go back to, just remember this, if you want to talk about this one, this was Brenda. All right. So now we'll talk about Linda. Linda is one of my favorite people to talk about. She's someone I worked with for a while, and she is she's just a really fun, really amazing person. And she is a woman with an intellectual disability. When I met her and worked with her, she was in her like low 40s, and she had a boyfriend. She still lived with her parents, and her sister was still living at home as well and everything. So she kind of, lived with her family and all that, but she had a boyfriend, and they would take her out on dates with the boyfriend. They were very supportive of this relationship. And Linda and I got to talking one day, and she was talking about how she really, once her parents, she was kind of funny about it, but she said once her parents finally died, she was going to get married and have babies, and I was like, well, that might not be so great if you're waiting until they die, because they're only in their 70s or something. So anyways, it was kind of a really funny conversation. But then come to, find out when I was going through her file and talking about some stuff with some other people, because we had team member checks and all that. I found out that she actually had a hysterectomy when she was 23, a full hysterectomy. So I was like, well, okay, that's a little concerning, because she talked about having kids. Does she really understand what any of that meant? So her and I eventually, again, brought this up. And so I kind of had a conversation with her, and I said, do you know what a hysterectomy is? And I explained it to her. And then she said that she knew that she had a procedure, and she knew that was one of them, but she had no idea because she had so many procedures over her lifetime. That she didn't know, which is also very common for people with disabilities, that she didn't really know exactly what it was. And when I explained it to her, she got very upset. She was really mad at her parents. She went home and yelled at them. Of course, they were mad at me, so we ended up having a whole family conversation and a family therapy session. And she was not as much upset about the fact that she wouldn't be able to have kids. She kind of really knew and understood in her heart that that probably wasn't going to happen for her, especially she was in her low 40s. She kind of would say things like, I know I'm too old. I know, that kind of stuff. But she was very, very upset that her parents did that without really explaining to her what was going on, without really telling her that we're taking away your ability to have children, that this is something that this was a major life decision, and they just didn't want her to accidentally get pregnant if something were to happen, because they knew she wouldn't be able to take care of the child. But they didn't let her be a part of that conversation. And that was something she was very, very upset about. So her and I actually talked a lot, and she was the one who decided at this place I was working, that a lot of people around her also had some of the same issues, the same concerns. And so she's like, we need to have a sex education group. And I was like, okay. So she became a huge advocate for wanting to create these groups. She went and talked, her and I went together and talked with, kind of the higher ups and how we could do this. And she was we ended up running a really, really great sex ed group that was part, kind of training and knowledge and information. And then also part group therapy, where we would all kind of talk about stuff. There's actually another girl we'll talk about next, Katie, who was a part of the group, who really got a lot out of the group as well. But that never would have happened if it wouldn't have been for Linda and her kind of being like, you know what, I'm mad that I didn't have this education, that I didn't have this knowledge, that, my parents did this to me and I didn't even know. And so I want to know everything. I want to know what I don't know. And because I don't want to be, in the dark anymore. So Linda is a really interesting person. And I absolutely loved working with her. So again, if there's anything anyone wants to, I'm going to kind of go through some of these a little quicker, because I do only have a few minutes, 30 minutes left. So, and I can get to talking, it's a problem. But if anyone has any issues or any, questions, concerns, things about Linda, I'll give you a second to throw them in there. All right, doesn't look like it. Oh, there we go. I got to give it a little more time. Yeah, so for this specifically, so the question is, what was IRB like doing this research? So for a lot of this stuff right here, these are case studies that were part of my clinical work and weren't necessarily working with Linda was not something that I ever wrote up for research. But I do have, in terms of working with individuals with disabilities, and I have done a lot of stuff around sex education and around just kind of more researchy types of things. I haven't done research on my exact clinical work, which I think would be a little bit different if I was, actually looking at my case notes and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, so the question is, how much autonomy did the IRB assume your respondents have, and what kind of permissions were you required to get to include them? That is a really good question. And the idea is that we, especially when it depends on the kind of research. So with surveys, we can kind of assume that the individual has the right and the ability to sign off for themselves, and we don't really have to check guardianship on that. But when it comes to doing interviews, we do, and we just have to ask them, like, whether or not they, have guardianship. Most of them kind of know. A lot of times, it's the parent who's reaching out to us anyways to include them in the research. So it is kind of a little bit weird and different, but there does have to be sort of the assumption that the person does have the ability to say that they want to do it, but that we do have to check on exactly who might have to sign off on that in the long run. Again, that's different for in-person interviews than it is for like doing like an online survey or something like that. And I know that that would be very different if I were to do research around my clinical work, but that's because research around clinical work is also very different in general. But in terms of my clinical work, not just doing research, I do also have to do the same thing where I have to get their signature and their assent, but I do have to double check and make sure who actually has guardianship to sign off on this, which is part of the reason why if the guardian wouldn't sign off on this, then they might not actually be able to attend therapy, which could be yet another barrier to that. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Let me know if you have anything else about that. All right, so I'm going to move on. I know sometimes with the chat, it like is a little delayed. So, but just in that, because of time, I'm going to kind of move on and we'll hopefully get back to like any questions if you guys have them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Katie. So Katie is a woman who was also at the same clinic, and it was more of like a day center that I was working at with Linda. And she was a woman who, so she has an intellectual disability and she also has a vision impairment, which became a big part of her story as well. But she suffered some sexual abuse at the hands of a staff member at the place, which did occur while like it had started before I got there, but it was kind of ongoing when I got there. And she would talk to people and claim that she had this boyfriend, but of course everyone kind of thought, and her sister had just gotten engaged. So everyone thought that she was like making this guy up, that she was trying to just be a part of, oh, my sister's engaged, or well, I also have a boyfriend. And, so people didn't really take her seriously. And then she actually was able to, she kind of had some conversations. They attended, this was a thing, they attended a sex abuse workshop that happened at the day program. And through that, she kind of like went up to someone and she's like, so I think this person is doing something that they shouldn't be doing because they're a staff member and they keep like coming into my room and doing all these things. And, again, people kind of didn't really take her seriously. And her vision impairment became a big piece of that because she talked about him making like, inappropriate gestures towards her at the workplace or like exposing himself. And people literally were like, well, are you sure that that's what you saw? Like there was literally just a, you have a vision impairment. You might not have even seen what you think you saw. And she was like, no, I know what I saw. Like, I know that's what he was doing. But so she had, but with also added on with that intellectual disability, she had a little bit of, issues with kind of fully verbalizing what it is that she was experiencing. So she was able to finally kind of get it through to someone and then to another staff member who kind of looked into it, who already had some issues with this staff member and was like, I believe that he would do that. So let's look into it. And it became she did part of her work with me was kind of dealing with some of that trauma, and that staff member was fired. But she then came to our sex ed group that I ran with Linda, that Linda helped me kind of set up. And Katie got a lot out of that group. She was kind of someone who was able to use the sort of group therapy piece of that to talk about some of her issues and everything. And again, working with me specifically on some of the trauma around that. And some of the issues. So again, that no one really kind of took her seriously because of these disability concerns that she had. And she had a little bit of an uphill battle to convince someone that this was happening. So that's the story of Katie. Again, I will pause for just, I know I'm kind of running a little low on time though. So I'm actually going to probably just move on and we can maybe have like a quick little at the end, if there's anyone else that you want to talk about. So just maybe take a little notes for yourself and we can go back to it. So, because I have at least, I have a few more people I want to talk about, and then some like little activities for you guys to maybe think about and do yourself. So next one is Claire and Nate. Claire and Nate are a real interesting couple who I got to know. I didn't work with them clinically speaking, but I know them personally. They both have a mild intellectual disability. They are also currently now older. So they kind of grew up in an era where if they had, anyways, they grew up in an era where their mild intellectual disability was sort of just seen as a learning disability. They grew up in a more rural community, so they were sort of just pushed through the system. It was this kind of idea of like, they will, they'll figure it out. We'll just keep them going. And they kind of just barely passed classes, but no one ever really gave them any sort of like IQ test or adaptive functioning test or anything like that. So they never really got special education. They didn't get anything like that. They grew up, they got married, they were high school sweethearts. They ended up having 3 kids. And then Nate eventually did also have a stroke. So he developed a bit of a physical disability. Well, Claire then had a really tough time taking care of, all 3 kids. On top of that, Nate having this issue and not really being able to help. And then on top of that, that intellectual disability, which has, some concerns with like adaptive functioning and, kind of the ability to take care of themselves or really kind of comprehend all of the bits and pieces that go along with running a household, kind of all came to a head. And they lived in a really messy house. Their kids were kind of always messy. There wasn't a whole lot, like not a whole lot of structure within the home. And what started happening is the oldest kid was not really consistently going to school. So at the time, the oldest child, he was 7, and he was not really consistently going to school. And so the school called Child Protective Services on the family. And they went out there and the kids were fed, they were, loved for sure. But there was definitely like, according to CPS, some like signs of neglect in terms of, like I said, messy house, messy kids, all that kind of stuff. So the kids who were age 2, 4, and 7 at the time were removed from the home. And Claire and Nate had to undergo counseling, and they also had to take a parenting class. And as part of their counseling, their counselor administered a couple of, like assessments. And for some reason they administered an IQ test, which is not really common. So it's kind of, like, we don't know why that happened, but that person thought that was something that was necessary for, for the case. And even though they went through counseling, they went through this parenting class, they felt like they learned a lot. They showed up to court and they said, we want our kids back and all of this. The court literally used their IQ test and said, you guys actually technically qualify for an intellectual disability. And so we don't think that you should be having, children in your home, that you are incapable of taking care of these kids. And so they were deemed as unfit parents, and they never got full custody of their kids back again, but they were allowed visits, and eventually were allowed like overnight visits. They were allowed to take them on like week-long vacations after they kind of, after a while. But were never actually given full custody of their children again. And the reason was given because they had this mild intellectual disability diagnosis that came from that. So that's the story of Claire and Nate. Again, if you have any things, just kind of keep note of them, and maybe we can talk about them afterwards, or feel free to, want to hit me up after all of this, because of course I've talked too long and now I have to finish my presentation. So the last one I'm going to talk about is Megan. Megan is also a really wonderful, amazing person who I have gotten to know and who I worked with a little bit on a clinical level, but she's just a really super awesome person, and is someone who is a really kind of shows the kind of what, when a person with an intellectual disability, when they're sort of given the right tools and the right, information, how they can kind of work to advocate for themselves and for other individuals with disabilities. So she is a woman with an intellectual disability. She is what a lot of people would term higher functioning. She has that borderline intellectual, borderline IQ. And then she also has a lot of really highly adaptive functioning skills, but she still technically falls on the disability side of those, cutoffs when you run those assessments. She had a lot of issues because her mom specifically, had full guardianship of her for a while. And she had a lot of issues with not being able to go to her doctor by herself and talk about some issues. And her mom also was a very, very religious person, and so was very against a lot, like, birth control, like giving her birth control because she didn't want her to see that as, okay, go ahead and have sex outside of marriage. Like she didn't want to give her that idea. And she also really felt like, every time she was in front of the doctor, she like couldn't talk about any of her reproductive issues that she, kind of would say, hey, I've heard of my friends who, who've gone and have to do these pap smears and all these things. And I've never had to do any of that. Like, why don't I have to do that? And, the doctors and her mom and all that were even like, well, we don't need to worry about that yet. We don't need to worry about that for you. Even though she was an adult, but kind of still that sort of feeling of like, to her mom and to the doctor, she felt like a kid still. She still felt like someone they needed to take care of and to protect. And her doctor actually recommended, once she was in her early 20s, recommended to her mom that instead of going on birth control, that she should maybe just be sterilized. And they talked about ways they could do that and how that would, how that would work, how that would look. And Megan freaked out. She was like, I don't think I want kids, but at the same time, like, I don't want to have that just completely taken away from me. And you're saying that only because I have a disability, not for any other reason. Like there's no medical reason, there's no, and like I said, very highly functioning. So she was able to kind of recognize like, this is happening purely because of like discrimination against my disability. So she actually went on and she was able to, she found a self-advocacy group and she worked through them for herself. And she was able to get, through that, she was able to get her own kind of guardianship over herself and was able to go back to the doctor and to talk about, all of the reproductive issues that she wanted to talk about. She was able to get on birth control and everything. And she really realized how important that was for her and how she wanted to help other people with disabilities do the same thing. So she went on to work for that self-advocacy group, specifically in the area of reproductive rights. Excuse me. She also really helps with making like easy to read materials that she hands out to doctors' offices, hands out to day programs and to people. And she teaches advocacy groups herself now. And she acts as a peer advocate for individuals and will go to doctor's visits with them and will, sit and talk with their families. And her and I have done a lot of like talking about, how to work with families. So kind of, coming from my family perspective and helping her kind of what are some of the things she can maybe say to families. So she's a really amazing person who again is kind of a good example and someone who I wish I would have had, a video to show you, because she's a really great person to listen to. But unfortunately, you just have to listen to me talk about her. So that's Megan. That's the last kind of case study. Again, if you have any, questions or things about case studies, we'll kind of go back to them maybe at the end, but I want to do like some quick reflection stuff for you guys to kind of have you start to think about some of these issues and things that we've seen or that I've talked about and how that might fit in for you and your work. So we can kind of, keep moving things forward, because like I said, it's a bunch of systems and every person can do a different piece of it. So what I want to do is just take a few seconds and think about when you think of the words justice and when you think of the words health and kind of what are some other terms that come up for you. No need to write anything. I'll just kind of, give us like 30 seconds or so, but just for yourself, maybe like, on a piece of paper, write down or think, when you think of justice, what are some other words that come to your mind? When you think of health, what are some other words that come to your mind? And like I said, take about 30 seconds to just think about those or write them down. Okay, so after kind of thinking about those a little bit in those terms, think about some of the things that you just wrote down or some of the things you just thought about, and then think about how the word disability or the idea of disability fits into some of the things that you just wrote down. Kind of thinking about, if you were, thinking about just different types of justice or areas in which you could see like where you think justice, justice work can take place, or when you're thinking about health and healthcare, just how disability fits into some of the things you've reflected on. And again, I'll just give like a quick 30 seconds and then we'll go on. Okay, so in further kind of reflecting on this and thinking about future planning and what you guys, and we'll just, again, just, you know, for the sake of time and everything, have you guys kind of reflect on this yourself, think about it. You know, it'd be some great stuff for you to really kind of take the time to think about on your own. But I won't try and make anyone share anything. So thinking about these sort of 4 areas of like, you know, kind of areas that you could potentially do some advocacy or activism, some areas where you could have a bit of an impact. Kind of taking one of these or a few of these and thinking about kind of for you personally and with your, you know, community and your things, like exactly who could you actually like start interacting with, or who could you, you know, in this realm. So like if you were to take community, you know, who is actually a person or a place in your community that related to your work, related to the things that you know how to do, that you could reach out to or you could start working with, you know, what exactly would be the activities or the things that you know you could do to help in this area? Like where would you start doing that work? Where would be a place or a person? Why is that a piece that's really important? And then how exactly would you go about doing that? So like, for example, for me personally, you know, I could very easily take families and individuals, and I could think about like, you know, wanting to help those kinds of families that I've kind of worked with before and helped before, doing, you know, kind of advocacy work and trauma work with them, trying to help train them or to help them become more comfortable with advocacy work. Where I would do that, I would go out into my community and I would find a place, maybe reach out to some of my old places that I used to work, and see if I could start taking on some family clients with them. You know, why would I do that? Well, because helping those individuals on that level gain that type of knowledge and experience and understanding can help them kind of move on to make changes, and that they will help their other families and friends that they know as well by passing that information along. And again, how, you know, I would need to reach out to my community and say, hey, this is something I'm interested in and I can go ahead and do this. But you could even just think about this on an individual level, like on a personal level. What more information do I maybe need to get? What more reflecting do I need to do individually to kind of start doing some of this work? How can I take disability into my work that I'm doing? How can I maybe understand that? How have I maybe been ignoring it in a way, if I'm not someone who works with disability, that maybe now I have this knowledge and I can start to see how that can impact. So just again, kind of thinking through this yourself, this future planning, what is something that maybe you can do in the next few months? And this is something, you know, that obviously this presentation is all about disability and like reproductive rights and maybe what are some things that you can do to help this problem. But at the same time, when it comes to kind of disability advocacy in general, or even just advocating for a group of people who you happen to know deal with issues of oppression in your community and in your, you know, and just groups of people in general, you know, you can kind of think about this. Like, what is something you can do in the next few months? What's an actionable item you can do? What is an obstacle or something you see that you are like, oh, I can see that happening. I can see why this is a problem and I have something to do about it. I have the ability to do something. What is this? What can I attack? Who else can I reach out to help me do this, to help me be a part of the solution? And then also, what are some potential long-term goals that you could create for yourself in this area? And like I said, you know, obviously this presentation is about disability, but you can apply this to kind of, you know, any sort of advocacy work that you might be involved in or could potentially be involved in. So quick little take home message. Just remembering there's these kinds of sayings that happen among the disability community. There's this giving a voice to the voiceless, which some people have some issues with and some people like. But kind of just remembering, and then nothing about us without us, just remembering that, you know, people with disabilities sometimes have a hard time being heard. They have a hard time really knowing how to speak up for themselves, how to say those kinds of things. And that, you know, if you are someone who has the ability to do that, that you should. If you're someone who has, you know, the ability to speak up, the ability to go into a situation and feel heard, you know, if you are an individual without a disability, if you have other, you know, levels of like power and, you know, that power and privilege that you're aware of, that you make you a person that will go in and people will listen to, you know, that might be, you have the ability, like I say at the bottom there, you have an impact, you have the ability to make that impact, and you should go ahead and do that, and thinking about how that, you know, for you. And the other big take home message that I think is important from today, from this thing, is this conversation we've been having, is the idea of capacity building, the idea that, you know, you have the ability to do something, but one of the best things you could probably do is teach a person with a disability how to do that themselves, so that they can do it themselves next time, so that they can pass that along to somebody else. and to think about ways in which you can have an impact in that way, in helping build capacity in your community, and what are your strengths that you can take into kind of doing that. So those are the big take-home messages for this lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you at least, heard some interesting stuff and maybe made you think a little differently about your work, or made you think a little differently about, people with disabilities, working with people with disabilities. So I think we have a few minutes. I don't know if, I have my email there if anyone has any questions or anything they want to talk about. But if anyone wants to do any last minute, we have I think 3 minutes because I talk too much. So feel free to write something in the chat box or go ahead and unmute yourself. But thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you being here, and I hope it was helpful.
All right, well, it doesn't look like there's any more questions for Becca, so I'll wrap it up just a little bit early. But thank you all very much for coming. And just a reminder that the next session is at 1 o'clock on transnational feminisms, women in conflict. Thank you again. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.